advocate. What an extraordinary film. We're honored to have the directors Rachel Jones and Philippe Bechal. Nasreen Raja Badlinda. I'm an advocate in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I work primarily in constitutional and administrative law. Rachel, Philippe, welcome. Thank you for taking time to be with us tonight.
Thank you.
Hello.
Very much. It's an honor to be screening at this festival.
I would have loved to be able to sit down with both of you in person and welcome you to South Africa in pre-COVID-19 times, but thankfully technology allows us to meet virtually. So let me start by saying I watched the film about a week ago, and it has stayed with me since then. I've had various scenes and moments from the film coming back to me in flashes, which I always think is one of the signs of a great film. But in this case, I think it's probably also a reflection of the fact that the film has personal resonance for me on many levels. First, because there's so many parallels between South Africa and apartheid and the stories told in this film. And I would have hoped that had I been born a few years earlier, I might have done similar work to Leah under apartheid. But also because I have a son who's the same age as Ahmed in the film. And so I relate very personally to in that sense. There are very many wonderful, committed human rights lawyers in Israel doing amazing work. Why did you make a movie about Leah Tsemo?
Yeah. Human rights lawyers that we can see in the field are burnt out. I mean, or are arriving to, after a certain amount of years, to a state of burnout. And Leah, in this sense, is amazing. When I first met her, it was something like almost 20 years ago. She was absolutely the opposite of what I imagined a human rights lawyer should be. You know, with my mind of a young man, I was imagining human rights lawyer being someone very stern and, you know, having on her shoulders all the pain, if not of the humans, but at least of the Palestinians on her shoulders. And she was the most vivid and curious and energetic person I met. So I thought, okay, she's so far from what I imagined she would be. It's already a good reason to make a movie on her. But then time went by, and some 10 years ago, I told Rachel that, well, nobody made a movie on Leah. Maybe we should do it. And we hesitated. But when 5 years ago, we realized that she was reaching 70, then I didn't ask. I just didn't ask her. I just thought, well, I don't know about you, but I'm going to meet Leah and propose her to film her.
Yeah, it was the right time.
I think it was the right time also for her because she knew us enough to trust us, and probably, you know, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we would have disturbed her. And now she was also ready to have a movie made on her, not only on her today, but on her trajectory.
When you talk about the possibility of disturbing her as you filmed her, you know, there are two scenes that I recall. The one where she's having a disagreement with Tariks outside the courtroom about the strategic direction that they should have taken in court. And he's very angry with her. And the other in the taxi after the verdict, where they are clearly very moved and upset about the verdict that's come down, this horrendous verdict. But they're fighting about the route to take. and where the most traffic would be. And it occurred to me that you were able to make yourself so invisible that you were able to capture what should have been quite private moments. As lawyers, that discussion outside the courtroom about between co-counsel, when you're upset with your co-counsel, generally you keep that very quiet, you know. How are you able to be so invisible?
I think that once she agreed in full, and there was no censorship. She made a point to clear things with, you know, with clients and so on, to let them know that as far as she was concerned, we were trustworthy and that nobody would, you know, no harm would come to anybody from the exposure, both with colleagues and with clients. And we have been doing documentary work in Israel, Palestine, respectively and together for 25 years. And we know our human material. I mean, we know how to relate to people. We know how to create complicity. And basically, she gave us her full trust, and we reciprocated with our integrity. Her working assumption was that we would function with integrity, which we did. You know, no complaints. But no complaints. We're too far in. There will be no complaints either. Absolutely. And that's a kind of a reciprocal relationship that you develop with your characters in documentary in general, even when the materials are sensitive.
Yeah, you need also to imagine that we've been filming her and Tarik for so long. You know, it's not like we were journalists coming only on this day filming them. We've been following 5 cases. We've been filming for more than a year.
Oh, okay.
Not saying that we were every day at her office, but very often, very often. And so when the moment of this dispute in the corridor or the taxi, when comes the dispute in the corridor, we've been almost every day that there was an audience of this case, we were there, and most of the rushes that we filmed are not in the movie. So when it happens, it's not the moment for Tarik to say, just a second, there's a camera. I mean, he knows that there's a camera. Even if the camera was not here, was just saying, why didn't you come? You should. There was an audience.
We had a hell of a fight that day.
There was an audience. Why didn't you come? And for the taxi scene, you know, for a documentarist, it's exactly the moments where you want to be there. You want to be there when what's at stake is so important that there is a camera, there's no camera, it doesn't.
The camera isn't what is writing the sequence of events. They're happening anyway. And I just need to help you good people of South Africa out. He's Francophone, and when he says audience, I think he means hearing.
Hearing, yes.
The hearing, hearing, and he's calling it audience.
Une audience, oui, okay, right.
Okay, we understand. So you said you followed 5 different cases. Why did you choose these 2 cases?
When the uncle and the father come into her office, fairly early in the film, and I'd say also accurately fairly early in the filming, we knew that would probably be one of the cases. Let me just backtrack and say that we started filming in early 2015. Leah had been doing what she was doing for some odd 43 years, and our working assumption was that the heydays of DESMOND were over. She was still very much active and engaged, but you know, the big cases, the history that she made had already been made largely, and all we needed, in fact, was that it would largely be an archival or sort of rehashing the past, sort of looking at what that life and times of DESMOND were. And if we could just find one emblematic case in real time that would give people the ability to understand that it's ongoing. That was our working assumption when we came into it. And quite soon after this new intifada broke out, one that had not been sort of known in 50 or 70 or 100 years of conflict, however you want to count it. And it was called, it had a bunch of different names assigned to it: the individuals intifada, the women's intifada, the kids intifada, the knife intifada. It really doesn't matter what it was called, but it was intense. And it was marked by basically individual acts of desperation that were political in nature to some extent, but were not politically orchestrated. They were not, they were not the work of political parties or movements. They were the work of individuals just who couldn't take it anymore. And disproportionately children and disproportionately women in relation to how things were in the past. And so this intifada started, and one of the first cases that came, one of the most sensational cases was a 13-year-old stabs a 13-year-old. Israel, Palestine media likes an eye for an eye, a boy for a boy, and they got their headline. And very soon after, the father and the uncle came into Leah's office looking for help. And we happened to be there. We were there already. And we could tell that in the first week or two, she just responded to this case very differently than she did to other cases that we were following already. One would think that it was because he was a kid. She's not insensitive. She too at the time had a grandson who was the exact same age. But we soon understood that probably what got her more than anything else was the way that he handled his interrogation. And the fact that she felt that he didn't fall apart in interrogation in such a way that he would provide his own charge sheet in the form of a signed confession before trial even began, which is the case by and large for most Palestinian defendants. The trial is determined in the interrogation room. And in this kid's case, she felt that there was nothing that was so conclusive and so damning in his interrogation that there was that a trial was not worth it. In fact, she was reading in that same interrogation that the judge just read and deemed the complete opposite. She felt that there was a lot of stuff there that was really that he had a good defense to mount. And she really did believe in his truth. And that in itself is something that is rare, to some extent in criminal law, certainly in security law, security jurisprudence, which falls under criminal law. And because she knows that she's going to lose 99% of her cases, she felt an ethical obligation to mount a trial if there was a case to be made, rather than close a deal. And she felt a moral obligation to not counsel a child to take responsibility for an act that she felt that he wasn't in fact claiming to have believed in, or to have thought that that's what he was doing, certainly not wholeheartedly. And because he's a 13-year-old, you don't put those words in a 13-year-old's mouth, right? And so she was just really stirred. And so it was clear that we were going to do that case. We followed the woman's case with some degree of ambivalence. We weren't totally sure where it was going or how to think about it or what to do with it. We knew that Leah was someone who identified all the way back in the first intifada that there is a tendency among women, not all Palestinian women, to act out in politically, let's say, to commit violent acts in the name of a politic, when in fact there's probably also a social aspect at work. And this seemed to be one of those cases. We followed it sort of, just cautiously, sort of what's going on there. It wasn't clear how it would play out. And it just so happened that they were sentenced on the same day. And so that case remained in the film. And then the balance between the real time and the past kind of flipped as we were working. Yeah.
So I thought you did that very skillfully. The movement between the past and the present really gave a real sort of context to Leah. You saw why she was doing what she was doing, and you sort of watched her develop. I thought that was very striking. And I thought the idea of the animation, half the screen, to presumably protect identities, was actually very powerful, because it also seemed to suggest that those people that were being animated were actually, it suggested they themselves were faceless, stripped of identity. Was that something that was deliberate?
Yeah. Animation, animation is so time consuming and so costly, it's always deliberate.
Right. Well, it was really very effective. I mean, one of the things that struck me was that you were talking earlier about why Leah felt so strongly about Ahmed's case. And, you know, there could be a suggestion that the film celebrates the notion of rule of law in Israeli courts, because there is a court that he's entitled to go to, because he's an Arab within Israel, as I understand it, not within the occupied territories.
He's sort of an in-betweener. He's a Jerusalemite, which means that he has a blue ID, like an Israeli-issued ID card. He has permanent residency, but not citizenship. And so he's sort of an in-between. He's in between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinian residents of the West Bank.
The reason that he was judged inside Israel and not in a military court is that the offense was made inside Jerusalem.
Okay.
And because he's a Jerusalemite, because if he was a Jerusalemite who did it in the West Bank, he could have been tried in the military court.
Right.
And the distinction would seem to be really important, because from what I read about military courts, you're not really guaranteed even a legally trained judge. So among many other issues, but he was tried in an Israeli court, and so there is this kind of illusion of a fair process. But I say illusion because when one sees what leads up to the court process, the indefinite detention, the lack of access to lawyers, interrogation of children, torture of children, then the court hearing which follows it would legitimize what would be regarded in most places in the world, including here in South Africa, as fundamental violations of human rights. Is that something that you thought about in the making of the film? I know you couldn't get into the court itself.
Look, we want to preface, we learned a lot making this film. We're not lawyers, right? So the things everybody should listen to us, because we have some idea what we're talking about, but take us with a grain of salt. We're not legal scholars or practitioners. We're filmmakers. The kids' proceedings were in Jerusalem civil courts. That's why we were filming in Jerusalem civil courts. Access to civil courts is easier to get than access to military courts. You go through the court spokesperson's, court authority spokesperson, rather than the military censor. It's simpler, but that wasn't the reason that we focused our stories there. They happened to take place there. Both defendants were Jerusalemites. You cannot film in the courtroom when the judges are there, but you can film in the hallways, which is what we did, and found that was, perfectly sufficient for conveying sort of the human fallout, the pain and drama that goes along with these kinds of cases for the families, for the defendants, for the lawyers, for everybody involved, for the victims too, who happen to be often will attend these trials. The circus, the media circus that happens. Leah knows very well, as do I think all people who litigate the occupation, Israelis and Palestinians alike, that they're living a contradiction. The contradiction is never resolved. The dissonance is never dissipates, and they live it nevertheless. On the one hand, Leah has been throughout her legal career the boy who's pointing at the emperor, calling him nude, basically calling out the system's most fundamental flaw, which is that the occupier is judging the occupied. But at the same time, she's also the little boy with his finger in the dam, trying to keep the flood of injustice from drowning everybody. And I think when you see that in the last few years, civil rights in Israel have eroded for Israeli Jews, and we are the most privileged in the food chain, right? The political and social food chain. You know that that's a kind of chickens coming home to roost. And the, you know, Leah, you know, she had her roots in what you would call revolutionary politics or ideologies, you know, but in fact, she's a serious pragmatist. And I would say that at the end of the day, after this long career, she's more of a reformist than a revolutionary. She's a visionary. She thinks about something really radical, which is full equality. Equal citizenship, you know, really, really radical ideas. But she, in fact, says, okay, there's a legal system in place. I know that by playing law for real, right, putting up a real fight, I am, in fact, legitimating that system. But if I weren't there to poke at it and to maximize what I can get out of it, for the client and for myself as a political being who wants to see social and political change, it would be going on unfettered anyway, you know? So she's got this kind of like, and if I didn't represent them, they wouldn't go to jail, you know, like,
right.
So I mitigate.
That's something that we battled with in South Africa as well, the notion of legitimizing the courts of the oppressor. Do you participate or don't you? And I'm not sure that there's an easy answer.
The question of boycotting the legal system among legal practitioners, and the law and the understanding is that if the defendants do that, mount a strike and say we're not playing, and you know, and the political prisoners do, most of the lawyers will stand by them. Leah will be the first to stand by them. She says, I can't mount that struggle for them.
Right.
That's one. And she also sees that as a site of resistance, with the potential of the legal domain as being a site of resistance.
It's one of the reasons we choose in the past cases that we expose in the film, the case in Hebron where the Palestinian just said, we don't recognize the court, whatever you want. We're not going to plead.
Yeah, so, they didn't recognize the legitimacy of the court as being able to judge them, and she stood by them in that.
Absolutely,
totally. She was proud of them, even. So,
it's what.
I mean, there is this very sad moment where you realize, you know, throughout the Ahmed's trial, her view of the trial is always that the facts and the law support her. That if the judges just look at the facts and they look at his confession and they look at the law, he should be exonerated, and that seems to sustain her through the trial, even when Tariq and the people around her are questioning her decision about how to plead. But at the end, when he is found guilty and sentenced to this horrific term in an adult prison as a 14-year-old, she seems to lose that positivity. Her speech to the journalists at the end talks about the defeat of the Israeli justice system and Israeli society. What was your sense of how she dealt with that?
I'm going to take a circuitous route to answer your question, if I may. You know, Leah starts out as a Marxist, as a socialist, as a feminist. At the end of the day, she's more than anything, she's just a humanist. And obviously people recognize that she's a humanist for seeing the humanity of her clients and humanity of Palestinians mounting resistance, be it nonviolent or violent, you know, against their occupiers and against the occupation. But what goes somewhat unnoticed is that she also believes wholeheartedly in the humanity of her adversaries in the legal system, the judges, the prosecutors, the interrogators. Otherwise, she wouldn't be mounting such a heartfelt defense. She believes that they are human enough to see the humanity of her clients. And they repeatedly don't rule as such, and they don't prosecute as such. But being an Israeli Jew and them being Israeli Jews, she believes that that's her battle, in many ways, that's her battleground. I will get you to see this story differently. I will get you to recognize their humanity, recognize that if nothing else, they have motives that you might be able to wrap your mind around, and actually even see the ways that you are collectively implicated in it, right? And I think that that's in many ways what has kept her going. That, and she just loves a good fight, you know. She just gets up in the morning and she channels her anger for the good fight. I mean, you know, she's like, okay, who can I yell at today?
Yeah, she's formidable.
She's, you know, she's, but she puts her chutzpah, or, you know, her gusto to, you know, to good use. Everybody should take all that, like, you know, all that crazy energy and put it to good use. And so at the end of the case, you know, there's something kind of bizarre about seeing her respond to the verdict, which there's a real gap. I don't know how it is in South Africa, but there's a real gap between verdicts and sentences. Sometimes it can go even for a few years. We had a 6-month gap between the two of them, and you see how she responds. She's sincerely kind of going, I don't get it. And you're thinking, for the audience, the audience is now going, is she for real? 45 years in and she doesn't get it, you know? There's also something fantastic about this I don't get it, because that's that, you know, 0.1% of sliver of faith in the humanity that maybe she'll get through. However, the way we edited it is right after she basically says, I don't get it, and she shakes her head, we see a clip of her from 30 years prior saying, I never win. She's sort of saying to the audience, wait, oh, you thought I was going to win? I know I don't win, but I go into every case believing that I will, which means, and that's how I managed to give it my all. I give it my best shot. She's not a cynic. She's not a fatalist. She's, you know, optimistic to a fault. And that's what keeps her doing it year in and year out, and decade in and decade out.
You know, it's what her colleague, the other lawyer that we interviewed very shortly at the end
Avigdor
of the film,
Feldman, the other human rights,
was with her in many cases, not only the torture case, when he says, okay, it's in her advantage. She still believes that it's possible.
Yeah, she believes in the idea of justice as a legal practitioner, which most lawyers will tell you it has nothing to do with justice, even though that's probably the main concept that we're all touting. And he says, but Leah actually really believes in it, and it's to her advantage. You know, when you see him, he's just cynical and like, you know, he's still working successfully, but something of that, you know, that passion is.
Yeah, he's in a different space to the one she's in.
She mounts that speech at the end of the movie. Now that we've seen the movie, and so we can actually, you know, say some more things about it. She's saying that to the Israeli journalists in the room, and by extension, the Israeli audience who might be tuning into those TV channels at that moment. She wants Israelis, she wants the Israelis to hear that if they don't shape up, or you know, that, I mean, she wants to claim good faith in the Israeli public, in some kind of a humanistic common sense, you know, that if you want to have a legal system, it has to be fair, or it has to be fairer. Otherwise.
And she has this, I mean, there's a point at which she talks about, and others that do similar work talk about relative successes, so that, what is the notion of what is a victory, what is a defeat, and so perhaps a victory is not winning but avoiding the death penalty, or a shorter sentence, or, you know, that sort of thing. And so I suppose in that context, she's able to keep some hope, and perhaps that's how she keeps going for so long, doing this soul-destroying work.
Yeah. I mean, I think that people like Leah and the subsequent generation, people like lawyers Michael Sfard, Gabi Lasky, there's a generation 2.0 and 3.0 at this point, right? Leah is 75. many of them will define themselves as human rights lawyers. Leah likes to play with that term. I think she thinks of herself as a political lawyer. She thinks that her end goal is political transformation, but her arena is as a legal practitioner. What does that mean? It means that not every win in court is necessarily a success politically, and not every defeat in court is necessarily a failure. And there's always another arena, which is the arena of public opinion. And these cases, and you would know this certainly as somebody who does administrative law, where you have cases of principle, right? And where you're you're representing a collective, those things can really sort of play both ways. Precedents in those domains can be used to your advantage as against you down the road, and so on. And so she's aware of that, and I think it also helps mitigate some of the losses, because she's also seen gains over the years, just as a result of wearing the system down. It's good information for those of you who want to get more into this topic. A book I'd like to recommend that Nasreen is reading now, which is The Wall and the Gate by Michael Sval. We also interviewed Michael for the film, but finally, like a lot of very good, brilliant people, didn't make it into the final cut. But he basically writes a history of 50 years of litigating the occupation, and he makes that point cogently, and he also points out all the ways in which Leah created procedures that didn't even exist. And those procedures were mostly about wearing down the authorities to make a certain oppressive policy. She would just the cost to efficiency,
whatever
that thing is in economics, she just made it not worth it. At some point, the obstacle she mounted, she didn't keep a single person from being deported, a single political leader from being deported. But at some point, they stopped deporting people because the headache, it was like the human resources and the time that went into the procedures, and they finally found other things. That was a success. However, then they introduced extrajudicial killings. So that success then, spawned a failure, and it's dynamic that way, and it's
Yeah, and I suppose to do this work, one has to be dynamic and respond to the shifting kind of political landscape and legal landscape. One of the things that I thought about watching it as a woman lawyer, and which I see has come up in one of the Facebook questions, is that it must have been particularly hard for her to do this kind of work as a woman. I mean, she just from the little I could see, she's kind of a diminutive woman, and she is a force of nature. So there's this part in the book you referred to, the Michael Sfard book, where he talks about her going into military courts in the West Bank and Gaza, which he describes as other lawyers' nightmare. But she strides in, and she just does it with what he calls a deep faith. And I think what he means is this kind of courage of her conviction that she's doing the right thing. You didn't really explore the role of gender in her work in the film. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? The question, I should tell you so you can think about it whilst you're answering, is that the question says, as filmmakers, how is the experience of filming the families involved? So perhaps you can link those, because the conversations with her children I thought were particularly interesting.
Well, it's right that, it happens that we were present, we even filmed one of the first interview that Michael Sfard.
That first one.
The first one that he did to Leah.
Yeah.
And he asked her the question, how was it to be a woman?
Sorry.
How was it to be a woman going into was it a
hindrance, an obstacle,
disadvantage? And surprisingly, Leah is answering that it was not, that it might have been much more difficult if she was a man. But that's in some way the to be a woman protected her from a certain type of despise, or, because from this man world, which is the military courts. Maybe you want to speak more about that?
I mean, Leah was very active in the early years of the Israeli feminist movement in the early 1970s, but has a slightly unique brand of feminism. A little bit of a pull yourself up by the bootstraps feminism, and not one that she necessarily thinks is, applicable to everybody. She doesn't preach it, but she definitely sees herself in that. She says it was an advantage.
Right.
Little tiny me with my, what are these dimples, right? My green eyes, she knew she was cute. She is cute. She's still cute, but she was really cute. There I am. I work with it, but I also have a filthy mouth. I like, spew, I'm very not lawyerly, and I'm not that, I'm not always lawyerly, and I'm definitely not proper and all that. So she would find herself, trying to banging on the doors of gates of military camps in the middle of the night and the storming rain, and be like, oh, the crazy lady is here. But she's also a sexy crazy lady. So like, okay, what do you want? My client, a little woman in the rain in the middle of the West Bank. There's Arabs all around. Okay, let's let her in, stuff like that. So she just sort of always felt that she could get away with more because she was a woman. And so she worked with it, because as a woman, what are you? You're a mother, you're a whore, you're crazy, you're a stereotype. Like you only have so many, things. And she was like, okay, so if you want me to be, I'll be this, I'll be that. Just let me get done what I need to get done. So that was her position, and that it was in many ways an advantage. She also said, I didn't have any pressure on me to get the villa or the Volvo as a lawyer. Nobody thought that I had to perform in any special way, in terms of social status and all that. So, and she really doesn't work from her ego. Right. I mean, she's got a perfectly healthy ego, but she's just not. She's not self-conscious, and she's not looking for credit. Her satisfaction is in results. She gets off on the results that she gets. She doesn't get off on the headline or anything else.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of her position about it, and by extension, looking at the question. By extension, her philosophy was, I'm a good enough mother. Good enough.
Good enough. Good enough is what we're all trying to be.
Look, my kids are so beautiful. They're so successful. Couldn't have been that bad, Like, so it's not that she doesn't have any guilt at all, but she doesn't operate on guilt either. That's just not.
How easy was it to have those interviews with her children?
Very, yeah. No, the whole family, we know the family, everybody trusted, everybody was happy to have the opportunity to share their voice. Everybody felt that if something came up that was too sensitive or too awkward, that, we would work with them around it. Nobody was grabbing and running. And more than how was it to interview, how was it to screen to enormous audiences with crazy standing ovations with the kids in the room, and then seeing the world see her in that way, that was really, really potent. That was, and,
she says that in the early interview in the film, where she says that her children have now got a hero for a mother after kind of suffering through all of the abuse when they were younger.
It was also specific to that time. It was the 1990s, and it looked like being Leah Tzemel wasn't the worst thing on earth anymore. But no, they appreciate their crazy mother. Don't we all have crazy mothers?
No, in this sense, we were really privileged, because even though I told you that I met Leah some 20 years ago. We've been meeting her, but we never saw her in work, just like her kids. Even her husband never saw her working. And as much as we were...
He saw her working when she represented
You're
him.
right. You're right.
Right.
But for the kids, it was okay. Now we understand what she's doing. It's not only a title. It's not only a sentence. We saw it.
Yeah, I can relate to that. The reality of COVID-19 means that in South Africa, we're currently doing court hearings over Zoom. And so for the first time, our children are able to see what we do when we go to work. So it is something that one tries to separate, I suppose, that you separate your work from your home, particularly where the work is so harrowing. Mm-hmm. So I'm not surprised that this was something new for them to see. I want to talk, I'm aware of the time, so I want to talk a little bit about Tariks, because that's almost for me a whole other story. And of course, it felt to me that in some ways he was doing the same work as Leah, being her co-counsel, but is younger and as a I don't know how you would term whether he's Palestinian, Israeli, or I don't know what is that the correct term?
He's as well. He's like Ahmed, so he's sort of in between.
But
which makes it all. Sorry, go ahead, Philippe.
In the game, he's a Palestinian. I mean,
right. So as a Palestinian, it must all feel so much more personal to him to be representing these defendants and accused people. And one would imagine his experience, although similar to Leah's, is somewhat different. And you start to see him unraveling at the sentencing of Ahmed. And we're then told hauntingly at the end of the film that he's been arrested for shooting at Israeli targets. And the notion that he was detained for a month-long period of interrogations until he negotiates his own plea is harrowing. So tell us a little bit, do you know more about what's happened to him since then? And can you give us a bit more context to that?
Yeah. Look, Tariks was arrested a month to the day after the world premiere of the film. We premiered at Sundance at the end of January, and at the end of February, he was arrested completely out of the blue for us, for Leah, for pretty much everybody who knew him, certainly for his family. And it took quite a while to understand what all it was about, because there was a gag order on his arrest and interrogation for the first 3 months, and he was denied counsel for the first month. And Leah and some other colleagues, lawyers who also took on his representation, were only able to see him a month or more in, when he had already gotten pretty far in negotiating his own plea. Since he was denied counsel, he also ended up acting as his own lawyer, which entails, desperation and hubris, both. At the end of the day, about a year ago, a final plea was signed, and he was sentenced to 13 years in prison, and he's now serving his prison term. He admitted to everything he was accused of, pretty much. He did shoot at various Israeli targets, both military and civilian, all in the West Bank, all beyond the Green Line, and nobody was hurt. But it was a very, lawyer by day, militant by night. I mean, there was a kind of a split that he was living. And this began after the last scene that we shot him in the film, that we filmed him. It was after the sentence. And in his interrogation, he said that sentence was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. We haven't seen him, obviously, or talked to him. We know from an article in Haaretz that was published soon after his sentencing, that his wife thinks of it as a nervous breakdown and says, he needed therapy. His colleagues think it was burnout because he was representing probably more of these Intifada children than anybody else in this time period. And Leah, in her own way, thinks of it as a kind of survivor's guilt. Where you participate in sending a lot of people away. People who could be your nieces, your nephews, your aunts, your uncles, your siblings, your parents. And at some point, the way Leah frames it is, he probably felt like, I'm no better than they are. Why should I be any better than they are? I'm no different than they are, you know, something along those lines. I mean, and all of those are interpretations, and, you know,
Sure.
and I would actually say that they're all interpretations that more lean to the psychological than to the political, although there's a political context at work. Yeah. And I think that they are all in their own way valid, certainly each person's interpretation who, you know, has some kind of a relationship to him. And our response to it has been largely that it's tragic.
Yeah.
And that an invitation to think about if he has been able to almost extract himself from his own life to that extent. What was the life that he was living? What was it for him to run up and down those halls of justice and see so much injustice? And was that worse than, you know, sitting in prison now for 13 years? And, you know, all of it raises more questions than answers. We certainly have no answers. We're not in his position in any sense, you know.
And it must be some combination of all of those explanations. That I would imagine that one can't continue to do that kind of work without identifying with the people you're representing, without feeling the guilt, and without feeling helpless that you keep sending them to jail or not being able to stop them going to jail, despite your best efforts as a lawyer. So there must be, you know, law is not always the answer. So, I mean, but that part of the story for me is very tragic, as is the notion that a 14-year-old child could get sent to an adult prison for so many years, and that it was 12 years that he was sentenced to, right? And then that on appeal to the Supreme Court, where one hopes that at the Supreme Court level that you will have judges who look afresh at the facts, and one would hope that would have had some reason attached to it, but they reduced to 9.5 years. So the notion that a 14-year-old child goes into an adult prison is, I think, one of the hardest things that comes out of this film. The ending of the film particularly is so hard because there's no respite. So the film in many ways is hard to watch. And I suppose that is the reality of Israel and what's happening at the moment.
You know, since 1967, an estimated 800,000 Palestinians have been arrested, detained, jailed, and imprisoned with and without due process for resisting the occupation, both violently and non-violently. And Leah Zemel has represented tens of thousands of them. Sometimes second and third generation from the same family. And I think that the South African case, this is something that I'm sure you guys can relate to from any number of angles on it, is that this is a people who have been criminalized and incarcerated en masse for some very basic aspirations for liberty. And Leah understands that it's with these people, especially these people, who almost every Palestinian detainee who has endured interrogation has endured some varying degrees, if there are scales to such things, of torture. It's with these people that Israelis have to share their futures. And it's also known that former prisoners and political prisoners tend to be actually people that you can really, really sit down and talk to. Prisoners also know the imprisoners, you know, the panopticon kind of concept, right? That and so, you know, there's also a lot to work with there if anybody wanted to work with all that. Leah lives that dimension of this conflict very deeply, and believes there's some unexplained reason that there's great reason for optimism.
Well, Sharon Jackson has posted a question that says that she loves that Semel's starting point is that Israelis are occupiers and have no right to judge Palestinian resistance. Who do you think will take her place when she needs to resign one day? Every country needs these citizen activists. But there are more people doing this work, are there not?
Yeah, there are people doing this work. I don't think that there's another Leah Semel specifically, but there are very good people doing this work, and they're doing it with the codes that are relevant for their respective generations and the realities within which they have come into activism, and Leah's is of a certain brand, and Leah's brand of being staunchly non-judgmental, as all lawyers in theory should be, if they're going to represent their clients well, but as political and social beings who are part of a society and so on, can't necessarily be. I don't know that we have exactly another Leah Semel, but we have other people who are doing really good and important work and are, engaged in the same kind of critical introspection, among other things. We're doing it because we should be doing it, because we have to be doing it. But should we really be doing this? Critically asking questions at the same time, not just not going through the motions of their professional and political trajectories as if they have the truth in their pocket,
Yeah, and hopefully this film will inspire lawyers who may not have thought that this is an area that they want to contribute to or could. Yeah. That hopefully will inspire them to move into that. My last question, because I know it's getting very late where you are. The film's won many awards, including the top award at the Tel Aviv International Film Festival. What's been the reaction within Israel? The question at the back of my mind is that in South Africa under apartheid, or at the end of apartheid, many white South Africans said, we didn't know this was happening. And the same is, of course, true in many other places in the world after the Holocaust, many other places. Is that a reaction that you've had to the film, and what's been the general reaction within Israel?
He's fading. I don't think that anybody in Israel can legitimately say they don't know what's going on. I think there used to be a kind of an activist slogan, not just activist, but, sort of a NGO, human rightsy, slogan in the 90s here that was said, just don't say you didn't know, because we're providing you with all of the, the written and visual information, infographics, whatever you need to know. Just don't say you didn't know. And I don't think that statement is relevant in Israel, 20 years later. I think that the predominant sentiment is we know and we don't give a damn. Or we know and it's justified, or whatever, just something worse.
Or we know, but there's nothing to do.
There's nothing we can do about it.
But there's nothing, the system is too strong, the majority is too strong, we can't do. And the big surprise that we had with the public, the film with the public, with the Israeli public, was that we discovered that many Israelis were thirsty to the voice of Leah Semel. Even though, as you just said, we didn't want it to make, in any case, an optimistic movie. And it's finishing in such a hard way, because what we saw, what we're seeing, is a very harsh reality. And we didn't want it to give any hope at the end.
No, we didn't want to sugarcoat it.
Exactly. We didn't want it to sugarcoat. But we discovered that Leah is giving hope.
Yeah.
And many people were saying, we need to hear voices like this. If we're hearing more voices like her, then we will feel more entitled to speak also.
Yeah.
Okay, and this was the reaction of the people who saw the movie. Many other Israelis, including the Minister of Culture, attacked the film without seeing it and telling,
and I won't
see it because there's nothing to see on a movie on such a woman. I even don't want to see it, and I'm against it. And many Israelis were also on this side, but for the one who saw it, and not only leftists, there was also some right-wingers who saw the movie. They were just saying, I'm glad I've seen this film, because the people on the right were more saying, I didn't know it was like this. Those leftists.
Right.
People were just like, wow, so refreshing. Someone who just says occupation, who doesn't like, the film came out at the end of some pretty ground shifting years in Israeli politics among Israeli Jews, and for maybe Palestinian citizens of Israel. The stalemate with Palestinians in the territories has been going on for a long time, but there was a real decline in the last few years. I'm calling it sort of the civil rights front, but for lack of a better term. And it was like without realizing that that's what we were doing when the film premiered, it was like we had opened up this window and fresh air, just sort of like a breeze, like broke this stale, kind of stagnant feeling where people were kind of had wilted out of their critical political stances. And this feisty little woman comes along and, barks at everyone. It says occupation. And they're like, well, yeah, her, let's be, more of her. We want more of her. And the reception was overwhelmingly positive. Even Leah, especially that was just like, wow, what's going on here? Are we in Israel?
So it was very paradoxical, because on the same time the film was attacked by the Minister of Culture, we won the first prize at Dokaviv, which was coming with a grant, and for a moment the grant was taken away, but then there was so much public pressure on, well, this is a red line. You can't make a so openly political influence decision on who will win or not win a competition. That at the end the grant came back, but so this was the paradoxal. It was turmoil. All the as well. What we can tell you is that we're Saturday night tonight, and already for 10 weeks now, there's demonstrations every Saturday night in Jerusalem,
outside the Prime Minister's house, residence,
outside Mr. Netanyahu's house, and it's in Jerusalem, and usually we are there. And tonight we're not, because
we're in South Africa.
But
what are the protests about specifically outside his house?
Just they want him to
general.
To resign. And
enough. We're done. Like enough with you. Coming from a bunch of different angles, so it's a very broad coalition of interests and sort of people being fed up for different reasons. The point is that there have been a lot of arrests at these demonstrations, and guess who's the little lawyer who sits into the night outside the police station and counsels them on what they need to say, and then goes in the morning to release those who need to be released because they're taken for remand. And dozens of people have encountered the woman from the movie, the one they saw on TV, or his students who happened to know that he filmed it, and you know, and even one of them said, "You represent Jews too," you know, like, anybody who challenges the regime.
Right.
It's good. And she's realized the extent to which the film has influenced, because these are really massive demonstrations. It's not the usual suspects of the left. It's a very, very broad-based coalition of fed up citizens.
That is wonderful, and that is the hope that I said was missing at the end of the movie. I mean, I think that certainly gives hope, and I'm grateful that you took time away from the protests to come and talk to us tonight. And I really hope that you keep screening this film and that we can screen it more in South Africa. I think there's another showing tomorrow, but we want more. And we wish you well, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us and talk to me today.
It was very pleasant to talk to you.
Yes.
Nasreen.
Thank you, Nasreen. Thank you. Super nice to meet.
Lovely.
Encounters for the opportunity, and to be continued.
Wonderful. And thank you to everyone that's watching. Good night.
Cry, are we off? It's just us. Okay, cool, guys. Good night. Thank you. Cry, are we off? It's just us. Okay, Cry.